Okay, welcome. Come on in, have a seat. We'll get started. I'm excited to start. It's a fun session. It's my birthday, and there's no place I'd rather to be than at the bank talking about data and conflict. So, welcome everyone. I'm sure we'll get more people filtering in, but we only have an hour, so we're going to jump right in. And I'm very happy to have a distinguished panel here. We originally started no data, no action. Then we changed it to more data, more action. Then we added the question mark. So the idea of this session is to interrogate a little bit the relationship between data and the production of data and all of the data we have and the action. Is it actionable intelligence? Is it evidence that we use? And does it inform the actions that we take or don't take? And so we thought it would be useful to interrogate that some. And the way we're going to do that, well, first of all, before I do that, how many people in the room consider themselves, and you can be both of these, by the way, to be data producers? Okay, good. Wow. All right. More than half, maybe. How many people consider themselves to be data users, policymakers, practitioners? Okay, good. So some of the overlap in there, but there were then other people. I needed some data to be able to understand where we were at here, right? So I think, and I was at the bank before I went out to become an independent consultant. I was working on the WDR 2011 as the economist on the WDR 2011. I think we've come a long way. I think we have a lot more data now than we did then. And we certainly have advanced on how we think about conflict, fragility, violence, and how we incorporate that into our thinking. That being said, with all of this data that we've created, I still think we're a long way from using it well to be able to design policy, to act. And, you know, I think a very simple example comes from some of the speeches we've heard today where people said we need to do more prevention. We have data, we have evidence that shows us absolutely that prevention is cost effective. No matter what your assumptions are on the likelihood of conflict, what conflicts you're preventing, the costs of that prevention, they are absolutely cost efficient to do prevention. And yet we still are not very good at prevention. And we've been saying that for multiple years since Pathways for Peace as well, right? So I think we're accumulating more and more data. There's lots of data out there. There are lots of people that do great data analysis and great data collection. And yet we still have this gap with action. So that's what I want to interrogate a little bit. The way we're going to do that is I've asked a distinguished panel, each of which, by the way, could speak for an hour about their particular project, the thing that they're working on, okay? And I've given them the challenge of describing that in only 3 minutes each, right? And the reason why we're going to do that is then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions, but then we're going to have some question and answer, and we're going to do a very talk showy format, okay? So that people can really engage with this. You can ask follow-up questions, give us your perspectives. There were a lot of data producers here. There were a lot of data users here. Give us your perspectives on these relationships and what you see going on there. And so it is a big challenge to get them to only talk for 3 minutes. I will introduce them in just a moment. But I've also given them the opportunity to put down some main bullets on this piece of paper you should have been given as you came in. So that supplements, that maybe adds a minute or two onto the 3 minutes they're only going to get on the stage here, gives a little bit more information to you, the stuff that didn't fit on the one slide that I gave them. And then absolutely, we're going to have some question and answer, and we'll come back and we'll be able to fill out more detail. 3 of the panelists are here. One of the panelists, we had multiple kind of events happen that conspired to make it so that the 4th panelist is connecting online. So Leslie will be connecting online. I'm going to introduce all 4 of them right now, but before I do, I'm also going to mention that Jay is here, and Jay is going to be our online mediator, moderator, facilitator. He's looking at the chat, and he will give us any questions that are happening there too. So the people that are online are part of this conversation as well. Let me introduce quickly everybody that's up here. Jeremy Biddle is the Director of Violence Reduction Policy and Program at the University of Pennsylvania Crime and Justice Policy Lab. He'll be speaking about Western Baltimore. For those of you who have seen The Wire, this grounds the story for us. And the order that I picked here was kind of the local to the global, if you will. So this is one of the more local stories that we have. Jason Lin is the co-founder of Data Science for Sustainable Development. That's a nonprofit organization that helps to be able to set up the capacity for doing good data science and good data science analysis, including some nonprofit chapters at various universities. And so it's an exciting initiative. They have Jason here, and also I think Laura and Josh are back here in the back. Raise your hand. They're from Data Science for Sustainable Development. If you want to know more about them and you need more data scientists, it should be one of the conclusions that you come up with from this conversation. Talk to them after this. Leslie McColeman is going to be the person joining us remotely. She is a research scientist at Brandeis University, and she works on the everyday peace indicators. And she'll be speaking to that methodology and that process. And I think you're going to see how that kind of grounds how data is produced and then how it's used, particularly because it's a participatory process. And Maja Lezik comes to us from the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, the UNHCR World Bank Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. She's the deputy head there, and she will explain this process as well. So we go from the local in Western Baltimore to the global when we're talking about forced displacement. Again, I'm going to alert you when you've used about 3 minutes. I won't be super hard and fast, but try to keep it to that so that we have time for all those discussions. Thanks. Jeremy, yeah, please.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to keep within 3 minutes. So I'm going to discuss a very specific example of using data to drive action on the issue of community violence or community gun violence in West Baltimore. My team and I were invited in by a consortium of local funders to help the city with the design, implementation, and evaluation of a gun violence reduction strategy. For those of you that aren't familiar with Baltimore, Baltimore by global standards is a violent city. 8 consecutive years with over 300 homicides, twice as many non-fatal shootings with injury, with the exception of last year, which is actually kind of a glimmer of hope, which one which I hope that our supporting council actually made a contribution to. We had the largest single year reduction in homicides in the city's history, 21%. So we ended the year under 300 for the first time in 300 homicides, excuse me, in 9 years. And what we did is pretty straightforward. Just borrowing from documented public health practice, we identified the underlying dynamics and risk factors that were contributing to recurring gun violence injuries. We implemented a tailored intervention to address the problem and the underlying risk factors. And then we measured the interventions to see how they went. And what we did was kind of take this lens and put it to West Baltimore. This is the West Baltimore, as Gary alluded to, of the wire, the West Baltimore of the death of Freddie Gray in police custody and the uprisings, the West Baltimore that is pound for pound the most violent police district in the entire country. 1 in 200 people in the district was injured by gun violence in 2021, and that's not really an outlier. So what we did was take this issue and try to actually break it down into, grounded in fact, grounded in data. And we combined quantitative and qualitative methods. We did extensive criminal history review of everybody that's most directly impacted by gun violence, being victims, suspects, and persons of interest. And we also did a lot of qualitative work, focus groups, interviews with homicide detectives, shooting detectives, proactive enforcement squads, street outreach workers, anybody that really knows the lay of the land in the street that can really help us gain insights into not only who's most directly impacted, but what are the underlying dynamics that are driving violence. And to that end, we took a very big problem to which the city had effectively no solution, and were able to distill it down into something that was actually actionable and was used to drive decision-making and help reroute millions of dollars in city and federal funding. We found that, public perception was it's youth, its economic motives, and its drug disputes. Well, we found that it's actually much more nuanced than that, but also quite distinct. As we see here, and if I'm getting my 3 minutes, I'm going to use this as my cheat sheet. Homicides and shootings were driven by disputes amongst group members of criminally active groups. Retaliation was a major factor, which is great because it means there's a point of purchase for intervention and prevention. People talk about youth, but the average age of a victim and suspect was 31 in West Baltimore. Really old. No infrastructure in the city to work with this population, none, in this kind of capacity. Unsurprisingly, victims and suspects looked very much alike. So to stop gun violence, you're also potentially working with the individuals that are perpetrating gun violence. It tends to be one and the same: heavy criminal justice involvement. The average victim or suspect had 12 arrests, 6 for violent offenses. So most contact disconnected, but very tight contact with the criminal justice system. Unsurprisingly, we found that under 10% of homicides were, had juvenile victims or perpetrators. 13% or less of the homicides were tied to economic motives. So people weren't pulling the trigger because you took my money or you are on my drug territory. Again, it was by and large interpersonal disputes. And what this boils down to, and I think this picture is a good illustration, is we were able to establish through these interviews and quantitative work that under 2% of the district's population was associated with upwards of 75% of all shooting incidents. So it takes a big problem and boils it down into something that you can actually work on. We did 1 million briefings, state, federal, local. It took a lot of work to socialize these results, but ultimately it led the city to stand up a strategy that has been seeing results. We had a 33% reduction in homicides and shootings the first year of implementation. Now we're 2 years in. We just completed a rigorous evaluation that validated those results. Decreases in gun violence, no corresponding increase in enforcement or arrests. It's kind of the, holy grail, if you will. So we've made a lot of progress that we're proud of. I think I'm probably at my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Only barely over, but I really appreciate it's a lot of material to cover quickly. I'm going to come back to you with a question about that socialization, that process, and I would love a little bit more detail on the quantitative, qualitative, but we'll come back to you. Jason, you're going to tell us about this initiative that DSSD did in Ukraine and the details about how you went about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gary. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me on this panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our projects with our partners, Insulate Ukraine. So again, DSSD, we provide data science services to other organizations. So a little under a year ago, we partnered and we met with Harry from Insulate Ukraine. His team had developed a novel solution that allows windows to be rebuilt in Ukraine. So this is a window replacement solution. It can be built for $15, can be built in minutes. And they're going in, they're insulating these homes because right now we're in the middle of winter. It's extremely cold and these people are freezing. And by insulating these homes, they're able to live in their homes again, able to survive the winters. So his team is on the ground repairing these windows with the solution. And so our goal here was to identify where are the windows that need to be repaired, where can we have the most impact? If we send in a certain amount of people, we send in a certain amount of material, where can we have the most amount of impact? So initially, they approached us with, you'll see on the PowerPoint here, that map of Ukraine with the red dots. That's a model produced by The Economist from a researcher we worked with. And that measures warfire events. And what is a warfire event? This is modeled based on what already exists. There's a NASA data set, so it's called FIRMS. It's for measuring things like wildfires. Essentially, it takes heat signatures from satellite imagery, and it classifies okay, so this is a fire event. What this does is it's about 100 models. You take 95 of those and see if they determine that this is outside the norm. So we have historic data for here's where fires are naturally occurring. And based off that data, we can say, okay, so these fires are unnatural. So out of 171,000 fire events in Ukraine since January or around February of 2022, we can determine that around 65,000 of those are related to the war, whether that's artillery strikes, et cetera. We're able to see where the most intense fighting is. So that kind of tells us where things are happening that we're interested in. If we combine that with an OpenStreetMap data set of buildings, so this is a data set that pretty much it's geometries of every building in Ukraine during that time that they went and they drew out. This contains metadata such as the size of the building, the address. So now we have 2 data sets. We have the location of where there's events that are related to war, like missile strikes, artillery strikes. We also have where buildings are. So with that iteration, we can say okay, within a certain radius of an event, we can capture this many buildings that were impacted. So from here, like we're able to go from here's where events are to the number of windows and approximate building damage. So by approximate building damage, Harry's team has been informed they can go in and they can have a certain amount of impact to a certain area, right? If a missile goes off in the middle of a field, we don't necessarily care. But in the middle of a busy street, that's a lot of impact, that's a lot of damage, and that's a lot of good that we can do. So if we know how much it costs to repair a window, we can also translate that to a certain like dollar amount. So that kind of can help us like inform policymakers or applying to grants. We can say that to repair like this region, and we can summarize it sort of by region, by ADM as well. To repair a certain number of windows in this region, we need this many volunteers. We need this dollar amount for materials for coordinating the volunteers, and they're able to go in there and actually have that amount of impact. So in this way, like we've iterated from just the raw open source data that's already available, and we can have a sort of impact. You see on the right side here on the slide, that's what one of those repaired windows looks like. So something that is just purely in data space, we do some analysis, we put different data sets together, we iterate, and then we end up with sort of real world impact. Yeah. So
fantastic. Thanks, Jason. Perfect on time. And it's really practical. This is real action on the ground. So very good example. I'm going to come back to you in a second. I'm going to ask about that iterative process. Now we're going to go to Leslie. And Leslie, you're online, I believe. We tested it before.
We did. Hopefully you can hear me and see me now.
Yes, we can hear you, and soon we can see you. There you are.
Great. Tell me when I should start, Gary.
Go.
All right. Could you advance the slide, please? Thanks so much. So thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about a project that I've been working on in Sri Lanka for the past 2 years as a consultant, as a research consultant with everyday peace indicators. So in terms of the problem, basically, we know that in post-conflict environments, it's really, really important to advance reconciliation. But unlike GDP, or homicides, which are also hard to measure, reconciliation is extremely hard to measure. We know that formal mechanisms for transitional justice do not always exist. In Sri Lanka, for example, they have been notoriously weak. And even when they do exist, counting things like the number of trials or the amount paid in reparations doesn't actually get us very far in terms of tracking progress towards reconciliation. This is a problem for international donors who want to assist in these efforts, but they aren't really sure how best to do that. So EPI's approach to this problem is actually quite simple. In essence, we ask communities what reconciliation means to them, and on the basis of their inputs, generate indicators that we use to track progress or backsliding on this front. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that. I can go over some of the details later, but the project that we've been doing in Sri Lanka, and you can see the timeline on the right that runs from 2018 to 2024, is to gather local indicators of reconciliation in Tamil, Muslim, and Sinhalese communities throughout the country. We used these local indicators to inform projects that were carried out by USAID under the SCORE program, which is focused on social cohesion. Based on surveys that we did first in 2019 and then in 2023, we measured change over time for about 30 unique indicators in each community. And then using a combination of this quantitative data from the surveys and qualitative data, we tried to disentangle the role of USAID programs in advancing reconciliation in these communities. I will, cognizant of time, jump to the punchline, which is represented by this other graph, which shows that local perceptions of reconciliation improved over time, at least during these 5 years. So not a ton, but in spite of a large-scale terrorist attack, COVID, and a devastating economic crisis in Sri Lanka, they did actually improve. And more importantly, when we divide this across all of the communities, this whole battery of local indicators into two groups, we can see that the ones that were directly addressed through these SCORE programs, which is the blue line, improved at a more rapid rate than those which were not addressed through SCORE programming, which is the orange line. So the two sort of big takeaways from this are, one, that there are novel ways to measure these elusive concepts like peace and reconciliation, and two, that targeted interventions may very modestly help us move the needle in terms of making progress towards reconciliation for communities themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And I know, I mean, trying to get all of everyday peace indicators reflected in 3 minutes is really challenging. I encourage everybody, we added contact information on here. You can be able to look these things up and contact the participants. When I come back to you, Leslie, I think that what's interesting and intriguing about the participatory process is the ownership and agency that is there because the indicators have been self-identified. And so we would love to get a little bit more reflection from you about how that's different and what it looks like when there's ownership and agency for those data, because it's actually about commitments and it's actually about behavioral change. And I know there's at least one person in the room that could talk to us more about behavioral change, but we won't go there yet. Maja, we're going to turn to you and tell us about the Joint Data Center.
Sure. Thanks, Gary. And I'm going to talk about the global challenge that we face with over 100 million refugees, internally displaced, and stateless people who, as we heard several times today, require a strong interface of development and humanitarian support. And for this, actually, socioeconomic data for effective policymaking and programming is crucial. But until recently, these people were invisible in national statistics or in any statistics, really. The data that existed often didn't meet international statistical standards, nor was it representative or comparable with the non-displaced or host communities. And very often it was also not accessible. So we embarked on this challenge with 4 approaches. The first one was really to look at the infrastructure and say, we need to support the systems and the standards to guide quality data collection. Secondly, we wanted to, we went straight to the field, basically, by supporting the collection of operationally policy relevant data, data that was national, and analytics that really included a representative samples of these populations. Thirdly, we focused on UNHCR, opening up a large humanitarian organization's data for others to use. And then fourthly, we looked at making a concerted effort to disseminate and socialize this data. So I've got 5 examples of impact, because there's so much to say about this and it's so diverse. So bear with me. Yesterday, we launched the report of Venezuelans in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, a development opportunity. And this is really where we've supported the data collection by national statistical offices and subsequent analysis, which was led by the World Bank, but also consulted with UNHCR. And this enabled the findings and the socialization of data to assist policymaking. Meanwhile, the governments themselves, also having collected the data themselves, are already socializing these findings into their own policy making. And we've seen several examples across some of these countries, how they have issued residence permits to the Venezuelans, how they're creating access to labor, the labor market, how they're including them in national services, and really recognizing the social and economic imperative here. The second example is in Chad, where we've seen the analytical work. So here's a government that has included refugees in their national statistics already, without anybody's help, really. But where we came in and supported the analytical work, and how that then has in turn supported the continued or guided the continued financing and program interventions by the bank, both addressing the existing refugee crisis, but certainly also the new one that has come in with Sudan influx. And a third example is the Central African Republic, where we have seen an unprecedented poverty assessment that has included data, or based itself on data that is representative of 500,000 internally displaced in this country, where they speak about a roadmap to solutions. So really also joining up with the action agenda on internal displacement, which is an agenda globally seeking solutions for internal displacement. Again, this is a result of World Bank working with national statistical offices and UNHCR on the ground. Then I want to end up with two more examples, which is really on opening data and research. And here we've seen how the World Bank's expertise and learnings from the public sector outside of forced displacement has helped UNHCR launch a microdata library in 2020. It now hosts more than 700 data sets free to download. And it demonstrates how an organization like UNHCR, who has a very sensitive protection mandate and therefore sensitive data, can open its data for use to the international community. And finally, with the data over the last number of years, we've seen that just in the 4 years that we have existed, has doubled compared to the last 10 years. So really what this tells us is that we have a new era for policymaking and programming in forced displacement. It's really this is what impact looks like when data and evidence is produced and when it impacts a really well calibrated collaboration between development and humanitarian actors such as UNHCR and World Bank. We're now focusing to increase the gains and the impact of this. So I'll be very happy to engage in discussion on that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks. So 4 great cases, 4 great examples, all really well done so quickly. I really appreciate it. It gives us lots of time for discussion. I have 4 follow-up questions, and then we're coming to all of you. I could ask questions all day, but I really hope that there will be questions here. But I do ask you, when you ask a question, you'll have to use the mic because we have people online and they won't be able to hear you unless you use the mic. So please be mindful of that. But first, let's do one quick lightning round here. When I come back to you, Masha, I'm going to ask you, because we talked a little bit about, and this is kind of a follow-up to what I'm going to ask Jeremy, about the narrative story, about connecting data and socioeconomic data into the story that's being told, which is how UNHCR is used to telling stories. So I would love to hear a little bit more reflection on that. But you've all heard each other's cases too, so feel free to respond to those or draw parallels, whatever you like. Jeremy, I promised I was going to come back to you about socialization, the socialization process. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Absolutely. I probably have 30 different versions of the problem analysis PowerPoint because I was kind of put on a roadshow to spread the gospel to anyone who would listen, pretty much, from community sessions to writing in local press, to appearing on local radio, to speaking with policymakers and funders. We probably held upwards of 50 briefings. And this was really about just taking those results and just socializing it as broadly as possible to anyone who would listen, but especially to the people that really held the, had the ability to really influence, funding and programmatic decisions. And, as I mentioned, it paid off. It was painstaking, but we were able to create not only a common understanding of the problem based on, this analysis, but also drive collective action and really galvanize a lot of support behind the strategy that the city decided to implement as a result.
And one quick follow-up on that, and something that people take for granted. We're used to working in institutions with all the data, and we use all that data. In the bank, we use the IEG ratings and the project ratings and all this data and dashboards and statistics. But interestingly, in places with political actors and political change, it's an interesting commitment device to have them now accept that this is data, this is how data is used, And the expectation would be that if a new government comes in, they have to play by the same rules now. So data becomes institutions. And I think you're grappling with that in Philadelphia. Speak briefly to it.
So absolutely, I think part of the process was also to generate external accountability so that if there were a political administration change, the understanding of the problem doesn't change and the work continues. Speaking of which, we're actually in a political year, an election year. We've got primary elections coming up in May, and that will be the real test to see if there is an administration change, how does it hold up? So folks are confident. I mean, we've done initial outreach, soft outreach with all of the other candidates, but time will tell how everything fares.
Fantastic, thanks. I mean, it's something we obviously deal with in fragile states, right? So that's not an unusual problem or challenge for us. For DSSD, Jason, you talked about iterations, and we just talked about how many consultations it took. How many iterations did you have to go through? How many times did you have to change it? And I understand you're iterating again now with the data.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, iteration is key to successful data analysis. I think it's key to a lot of things these days. But for us, in the approach, we analyze probably 3 or 4 different approaches that we could go from. So like this data set that they were already using, they're already following this model of where is the fighting happening in Ukraine, to how do we go from that to where are the damaged buildings, where can we have the most outsized impact. We landed on this approach. It was a deterministic approach where we can say, okay, we can directly link, here's a data that a building exists here and a bomb dropped next to it. So we can extrapolate that data and say, okay, we're having an impact there. So we're about to iterate again. So this relationship, this project is still ongoing with our partner, and we're trying to get more accurate measures. And we're incorporating more and more data sets. And the reason for that is because we did analysis, we tested data, and we found that this was an underestimate. And so we obviously want to be more accurate, and that's the whole point. We want to keep pushing for greater accuracy, want to keep pushing, just get a better analysis in the end. Things we're trying to incorporate now is things like cloud cover. If you imagine a satellite passing overhead, that's how we're measuring these warfire events. If a big cloud is over the area, well, you're going to miss the event. And the satellite also has to go around the Earth. I mean, I wish it could hover over 24/7, just give us perfect data always, but it does have to orbit around the Earth, and we miss some periods information. So from that, it is a bit of an underestimate. So we can incorporate other factors, maybe we can add that as a variable, like cloud cover. That's one area we're trying to iterate towards now. We can add in other data sets. We recently came in contact with another researcher, Ollie, who has a building damage data set that is through a manual analysis of satellite imagery. Their team evaluated damage on the ground. So we can take a look at that data set and see how that helps us as an additional input towards analysis. So it's constantly iterating. We're always looking to improve and get more accurate results. And it's really never finished. I guess there's a certain point where you say, I guess we're satisfied enough. We can always get better with more data, better analysis.
Great, thank you. We go to Leslie. Leslie, I asked you a question about ownership and agency of data. How do we understand and interpret it, and what changes in behavior because of the participatory process? Maybe you could reflect a little bit more on that from the Everyday Peace Indicators experience.
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. And I focused a lot on sort of the external uptake of the data, right? How it was used to guide external actors who then proceeded to, implement programs in communities. I didn't speak as much about what you're asking about, which is the other side, and I think one of the strengths and novelties of the EPI process. So the communities where EPI works are typically quite poor, have often, been displaced, experienced excruciating levels of human suffering, and as such are not engaged in sort of day-to-day data, right? They're not used to seeing themselves reflected in this sort of systematic, social science-y format that we bring to the table. This process of very sort of systematic, sequenced community consultation, which involves focus groups and with men and women and youth, and then bringing them together and vetting and voting, in and of itself we see has a utility. And more so than individual behavioral change, as a sociologist, what I see is that it sort of catalyzes a process of collective reflection and prioritization about what do we understand certain things to mean, how are they impacting different people in the community, what are our demands, what are our grievances, and how do we prioritize them, which is an important part of the voting process. So it's making public things which oftentimes people are already sort of talking about privately, and catalyzing a sort of so that in and of itself has value. Then there's the second step, right, about taking action on the basis of this data. And that EPI has certainly experimented with a lot, not as much in this project that I've been working on in Sri Lanka, although that's a very small scale exercises where we're headed in the next few months. But it's not only about understanding in a more systematic fashion what's happening in this community in relation to, whether it's peace building or reconciliation, but what can we do to address some of the problems that collectively we face, right? And that's about collective action. It's about catalyzing collective action that in some cases allows communities to come together to address problems that they themselves actually have the tools to solve with very small amounts of external support. In other cases, it means organizing around advocacy, which can be towards regional actors, it's often towards government actors, and using this as sort of informally as sort of an evidentiary basis of this is something that's occurring, it's widespread, and we would like to see it solved, and here's what we recommend.
Yeah, a quick follow-up on that. One of the things that people can't grok if they've never understood the everyday peace indicators process, if you come from an institution like the World Bank and you think that there ought to be standardized indicators, or if you're used to working at UN stats and you think there ought to be standardized global indicators that just measure a thing, the first instinct that people that have that approach have when they encounter everyday peace indicators is to run out of the room screaming, because you're telling me that we're going to come up with a very, very local and social kind of identification of what an issue is and how they're going to know and measure it. But what she just said at the end there is that the outcome that the donors or anybody else, the policymakers actually wanted, the collective action that addresses, after collective reflection, some prioritization to be able to create social cohesion, that outcome is still measurable. And yet there were a host of local indicators that were identified through everyday peace indicators and through this process. So sorry, I spoke a lot there, but do you want to reflect a little bit more on that, Leslie, because you're the expert on it?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. What's if there's a specific question I could speak to, that would be helpful, because I'm worried I'm going to go off on a tangent.
How do you reconcile the demand for global indicators and comparable indicators, metrics of success and impact that donors have, to we are producing a participatory process that doesn't actually, at the ground level, it doesn't do those things, but ultimately it can? Yeah,
my quick answer is it's a work in progress, because I can see the issue from both sides. I think because so much of the emphasis to date has been on producing standardized indicators, there hasn't been as much experimentation with this more inductive, locally rooted, and hence locally variable indicator production. We certainly are refining the approach, which, for technical folks in the audience, if the thing is measured differently in every place, how do you compare? You can compare across over time, because you compare the level of the thing before to a level of the thing later. How do you compare across locations, right? And so in order to do that, we have a coding process that allows us to essentially compare things which otherwise would not be comparable. The coding process is certainly a work in progress and improving, and we learned a lot over the course of this project. But I think critically, I would understand the next phase of EPI to be to press even harder on connecting these local indicators and what they allow us to measure with different types of measurement systems and, sort of even more objective outcomes, if you will, because so much of what we're measuring has to do with local perceptions. And I know there's been some work in that regard in Colombia looking at local people's perceptions of peace building processes and concrete outcomes from the transitional justice process.
Thanks. Sorry to put you on the spot, but thanks. I appreciate that. That gives a little bit, I think, a little bit more grounding of it for people that are in the room. Maja, I wanted to ask you about the narrative story and the ways in which UNHCR tells a story, the way in which World Bank tells a story, and now how you're reconciling those. Because stories, as we've just heard, socialization, it's important.
Absolutely, and it's a great question, and there were so many things that was. It's nice to be the last one because you kind of get all these nuggets, right? So let me take departure in our new strategy, where the fourth strategic priority is about operationalizing data and evidence, and in addition to that, to highlight that a huge sort of red thread in our strategy is about sustainability of what we do, because we're time bound. In 4 years from now, we should be walking out in the sunset and not really be needed anymore, because our parent institutions would have taken over the work we're doing. Governments would have included these populations into the national statistics, and other partners would be using the data, right? So that's the holy grail for us. But what does that mean in terms of two institutions who have comparative advantages and are complementary but not comparable quite, right? So for us, that means that UNHCR has to start using socioeconomic data in their advocacy, in their communications, in their planning, in the way that they see the world. They need to add the quantitative analysis to their qualitative work, and the qualitative work in UNHCR is protection monitoring. It's being on the ground, being with refugees, with local governments, with other actors, and working with them, and having a rich knowledge base there, having the population data. But they need the socioeconomic data. They need to be able to address the comparability of the situation between refugees, IDPs, stateless people, and those communities that they're operating in. On the bank side, we need to see that the socioeconomic data that is being more and more produced now and owned by governments, that forced displacement becomes mainstreamed into the vulnerable population groups that the bank already is looking at, right? And to give you an interesting anecdote, very often when we speak with bank colleagues who are, on internal displacement, they will say, well, aren't they just nationals? Like, are they not just, included already? And they will be in the data, right? They don't realize that actually IDPs are not captured, and it's very simple things such as, as an IDP, you're forced to displace, you're displaced because you're forced to it. So therefore, the whole sort of moving from one location to another is not registered anywhere. So when the survey comes, you're just not captured. But at the same time, there are also other issues, right? You are particularly vulnerable because of the conflict or the violence or the natural disaster that you have been a victim of. So that's in terms of the mainstreaming and maybe and partly also the question that you asked about the narrative. So the narrative in UNHCR needs to become a combination of qualitative and quantitative data that lies behind it and builds it up.
Yeah, and then we have interesting examples, right, from Western Baltimore, but from the countries that are incorporating this data into their decision making, they're using it as part of their evidence base. I think that also kind of those are metrics of success. I am conscious of the time, and there's 1, 2. So please, I remind you that we go there. So then you, and then you, and then this gentleman. Okay, now it's on.
Yeah, fascinating presentations. On the last point, which is how to operationalize this data from a programmatic perspective, and I represent the user of data. The information, the socioeconomic data, and all that is just the beginning. So after that, I have to do the targeting, I have to do the selection, I have to do the intervention, I have to measure the impact, and I have to make it so that it's somewhat sustainable, the impact that is, with a moving target, which is the displaced population. On top of this, there is a lot of noise because you have 700 data. Chances are that the same population has already been treated by some other programs. So how can the data be made more user-friendly, not just in terms of the policy and the socialization and all that, but so that I can use it effectively in targeting, selection, treatment, impact evaluation. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Peter. Kyla, you identify yourself when you're speaking too. And then Jay, you tell me if there's anybody online too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayla Bonfilio. I represent the Mixed Migration Center. Our flagship data collection tool is called 4MI. I would love it if the panelists could speak a bit more about what determines a successful socialization process. So for instance, I'd be curious to know in the case of Baltimore, to what extent did you build in this dissemination roadshow into your actual programming, or did you just decide that you had to do it? Was it a part of your deliverables, for instance? And then in terms of thinking through what you would find, how much bandwidth did you have to think through what would your potential findings be in advance? And so who would you then target and how acceptable would those findings be? And then finally, we present our data in humanitarian working groups and field settings, and we find that despite the desire for data, there's a very low capacity in understanding how to translate that data into their action. And so to what extent is capacity building attached onto your programs to be able to translate that into action? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Catherine Shejit. I'm a principal expert with Integrity Global, and I specialize in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I had a follow-up question around the socialization process. In that process, did you run into roadblocks with power brokers or other stakeholders who had a vested interest in or who benefited from the status quo or particular narrative that wasn't supported by the evidence that you had? And if so, what were some lessons that you have to share with the rest of us who might also face the same issue? Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you so much for your talks. I'm also with the World Bank, I'm with DEC. My question pertains to the discussions around preventative analytics. There's been a lot of talk about that today during the plenary sessions. And the problem is that the majority of data that we typically collect around microdata happens during or well into the advent of a calamity, right? So it happens like we typically collect survey data. But the problem is that by the time that's happened, it's very difficult to prevent anything. And so my background was at Facebook and kind of like TikTok. And what we did during COVID was we tracked migration patterns of people that had COVID using their logins to Instagram. TikTok could be used to predict whether or not someone will change their buying habits based on whether they change their listening habits from Taylor Swift to Drake. There's a lot of different mechanisms that can be used to collect data. But the problem is that the majority of those decisions don't necessarily inform socioeconomic operationalization. Is that because there is a fear towards using less traditional mechanisms of collecting data like cell phone engagement and app data engagement? Or is it because we're more hesitant to engage with the generators or producers of that data, which typically are private companies?
Okay, a lot of questions there. I'm going to let you each field whichever ones are relevant, but I'll come back to you if we miss something. Okay, there was the stuff about usability and sustainability, the political challenges of socialization, the politics of data, We started to talk a little bit about capacity. And then there's these kind of new techniques, new data, new innovations. I have some reflections on those, but Jeremy, let's hear from you first.
Okay, so I will speed talk in the interest of time to allow my co-panelists time. But on socialization, we've worked in a lot of cities over the years. So we knew that the socialization process was absolutely critical, and had figured that we knew going in that it was going to be, important, and that we can do it in tandem with the kind of building the programmatic foundation. So it was all, it was all part of a grand plan, and just something that we developed again through years of experience. To the question so the second part of the question was to what extent we knew the results going in. We've done these kinds of problem analyses. So surprisingly, this is a country with a big gun violence problem, community violence problem, and very few people that do this kind of analysis. So I can count them on a single hand. We have a very rigorous methodology. It was developed by Dr. Braga at the University of Pennsylvania, who's my boss. And we knew based on studying this in jurisdictions, not only in the US, but even internationally, there's the pathology of violence is very similar. Small number of people, Pareto principle, small number of people associated with the vast majority of the violent incidents. We knew that there were going to be some nuanced differences in Baltimore. For example, one flavor is the very, surprisingly old age of the typical shooting victim. But we had an inkling what we were going to be seeing, and just did some preliminary data analyses in the beginning to kind of get that picture, but knew that we had to, continue down it. In terms of and I'm happy to speak with you more afterwards, I just don't want to take away their time. In terms of the power brokers and the, established interests that were, the answer is yes, they existed. That was a challenge, but once this got out of the box, there was no putting it back in. But there was a lot of resistance to change because, again, there were vested interests in just kind of continuing the status quo exactly as you called it. But we were able to navigate that. And fortunately, again, once it got out, there was no dialing it back. And the fact that we were able to do it with a rigorous methodology and with the kind of external validation factor of Dr. Braga, that really helped seal the deal for us.
Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. I really like that topic of socialization. I think it also ties into the whole point of the project that we're doing. It's sort of socialized like our approach to, or the team on the ground in Slate, like their approach to repairing these windows. It's not just to inform the team where they need to go to have the most impact. It's mainly after speaking with Harry, their biggest constraint isn't necessarily volunteers. There's plenty of volunteers, workers on the ground who are ready to install these windows. The biggest limiting factor is actually money and funding. And so part of our project and goal is actually to be able to inform the people who are providing the funding that this is exactly where your money is going. And this is how we determined that this would maximize the impact. So we're not necessarily like socializing the story, we're sharing that story, that narrative to the people who control the funding and who can actually have that impact. If his team received like $1 million, that can be around 50,000 windows installed.
Leslie, do you want to come in on any of those questions?
Sure. I'm going to come in on what I think was the second question that focused on dissemination, which was very well posed. So in the Sri Lanka project that I've been working on, EPI made a mistake because that project was conceived in, I think 2018. I came on in 2022, and we did not. They did not build in the dissemination of data or findings aspect into the deliverables, the timeline, right? The activities, which we later recognized was a major oversight, and we're now sort of scrambling to correct. I think in terms of how we get the data out there, to whom, why, and how, there are sort of different pieces of that. What I've seen, particularly in the last sort of 6 months that we've been nearer to the end of the project, is that donors, the international donor community, is quite data starved, and very. I heard someone laugh. I know there's an abundance of data, but there's also this desire, right, to figure out what works on these tremendously complex problems like, advancing reconciliation in a post-conflict setting. So on the one hand, there's a desire, and we saw this in a series of events that we did in Sri Lanka just last month. But I think the challenge becomes for folks who are used to getting things in bullet points and being given 3 actionable recommendations. Precisely what EPI is getting at with this work is the need to contextualize, the need to take into consideration the nuances of place, of history, of ethnicity, of local socioeconomic development, et cetera, of each community when devising this work. In other words, there's no single magic bullet, and that becomes kind of a hard story to tell given the granularity of the data that we produce. The second target, and this speaks to Gary's earlier question, is the local communities themselves. It's a huge challenge. It's a challenge because there are elephants. There was no petroleum for all of 2022. There's ongoing military surveillance, and lots of folks are not, don't have the reading levels to be able to digest, right? Who wants a 40-page report? That said, the indicators themselves are quite accessible to communities because they produce them. The challenge that I'm working with my team, and we have a call tomorrow to try to figure out how do we communicate the results of longitudinal surveys to, a remote community in northern Sri Lanka in a way that's true to the data, but that also makes sense for them to catalyze, future processes that we most likely will not be involved in. But I think of all of the audiences, the hardest one is politicians and government officials who, there's a capacity issue, but as other panelists have brought up, right, there's also, in some cases, a lack of desire for data that would challenge, either the political position or, the dominant narrative of why certain things happen or what would need to change. And so that, continues to be a challenge. And I've seen it in other spaces, and I see it in EPI as well. How do we bridge the gap between, how do we reach this ideal of evidence-based policy? And we're not there yet.
Thanks, Leslie. Mara.
Yep. So I'll start with the last question and work myself a little bit up, and I'll try and do it quickly. So the last question really speaks to our third strategic priority, which is about data innovation to achieve quality data, more timely data. And I think that's one aspect of it, but it's that strategic priority also looks at the use of data. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that we really want to look at innovation in the data sphere, tools such as TikTok, why not? Such as geospatial mapping, such as natural learning programs to make the data that is and evidence that is produced more digestible. So I think in those terms, that's to answer. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer your question. I don't think there's fear. I think there is concern that you won't get the same quality as the traditional face-to-face surveys. But I think there's an appetite, precisely because we went through COVID, and in COVID we couldn't do face-to-face surveys, and therefore we resorted to phone surveys. And it turned out that we got a wealth of data out of that, and we were able to build responses on the basis of that. So I think this is this is something that's going to grow and to become more. And we at the Joint Data Center definitely are committed and curious about this, and we have data scientists who are really working with you and others to sort of explore what is there and how can that help us, right? If I turn to the use and digestion, right? I think here we're working with UNHCR, who is actually putting out a lot of information in quite a digestible way, but we don't have the sort of pipeline of the socioeconomic data and the translation of that, and that is actually put out there in I learned from our global data service in a way whereby it's not identifiable as an organization. So UNAIDS is not putting its heading there. It's just saying operational data, meaning, if we have some main pipelines of production of data, then we should put it together in an integrated way whereby you can go like a one-stop shop, right? A refugee data finder, for example, and go in and see your qualitative data, see your quantitative data, get some context, get the legal lowdown on the forced displacement situation. And that's where we're investing some of our both financing and technical expertise to sort of create that space so that both development and humanitarian actors actually start going to the same places. Now, in terms of capacity building, that's a really important point, and particularly for the UNHCR sort of and humanitarian colleagues at large. They don't. You're right. They don't, because they don't use socioeconomic data the way that development actors do. And here we're investing in training and in investing in programs where we can distill the evidence and we can basically teach our humanitarian colleagues how to better take advantage of socioeconomic data and what that means for them in their daily work. And we just recently had some pilot training sessions, which were based on the evidence that came out of building the evidence program that FCDO, UNHCR, and World Bank did together. And the sign up, I mean, the appetite that was signaled, the sign up was enormous. We had like 200 spots maybe, and 700 people signed up. And the people who signed up the most were UNHCR staffers. And who were they? They were lawyers. They were thirsty and hungry to be able to translate that information into advocacy.
Jay, any burning questions? We're mindful of the time.
Mindful of time, yes. There's one question from Michael Offery-Mensah from Transparency International. He comments that I think there is an agreement that using data to inform action is key. However, it may not be that straightforward in some sectors, especially in fragile contexts. Can the panelists share approaches they would use to navigate access to data, particularly in post-conflict or fragile contexts?
All right, we have to balance here. It is the end of the day. I will briefly say that I've been in a lot of the processes, including with the G7, little G7 plus, on the IDPS process of identifying peace building and state building indicators. And the challenge was always finding things that could be politically acceptable, but also track and monitor progress over time. And so I agree that it's very difficult, but part of the reason, part of what I've learned from that, and part of what I was hoping to get to with this session, this is how I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to look like I'm answering the question, but I'm also going to wrap up, is what I learned was the importance of data diplomacy. That every time people are making projects that have a data component to it, the thing that we've learned, and we had an example from Leslie, we've had the other examples here, thing that we've learned is we don't give enough time for explaining what those results are, having the 3 cups of tea, socializing people, using time and those results. We don't have the answer immediately with the first round of evidence. We have some answers, and they may not be the answers to the questions that are actually being asked. And so we need to spend time and energy on data diplomacy. And that data diplomacy can actually inform us going forward, and it can actually solve some of the sustainability problems, because it actually is a way in which we invest in the future. There are lots of other initiatives that could have been here. ICG has a really cool thing that they're doing now. We try to invite them, but they're in Kenya. Lisa Schurch is doing the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion. You should look at her when you're talking about new media and trying to reconcile those. If people haven't yet, the Conflict Forecast Initiative is a really interesting one. Took large language model, looks at predicting conflict, and there's a lot of information there as well. We can't possibly do everything. So first, let's thank everybody here for their time and energy. And if anybody wants to have a cocktail and talk about data and conflict, it's my birthday. So, you can just come on down. Thanks.